She loved him like the empire itself depended on it. Maybe it did. Lysara Valicrest gave 5 years of her life, her loyalty, and her silence to a king who thanked her by calling her broken in front of 1,000 witnesses. They said she was barren. They said she was unworthy. They never stopped to ask why. If you've ever been thrown away by someone who should have protected you, you already know how this story starts. Stay until the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments, because tonight, wherever you are watching from, you are part of this tribe. Ma. The blood moon rose over Vilethorn like a wound in the sky. It had no business being beautiful. Lysara Valicrest knew that. She had grown up being taught that the blood moon was an omen of endings, the kind that came for the weak, for the unlucky, for those who had run out of time. Standing in the antechamber outside the throne hall, listening to the deep ceremonial drums begin their slow, deliberate beat on the other side of those iron doors, she thought that maybe the old teachers had been right about that. She just never imagined she would be the one standing at the edge of the ending. Her attendant, a girl named Wren, who was 17 and already old enough to know when to keep her mouth shut, pressed cold hands against Lysara's cheeks and wiped the powder from beneath her left eye where it had smeared. Wren's fingers were shaking. Lysara's were not. That was the worst part. How steady her own hands felt. How composed her breathing was, low and even, in and out, while the drums grew louder and the light behind the iron doors shifted from amber to deep, arterial red. "My lady," Wren began. "Don't." Lysara's voice came out quiet and final, the way a door closes when the person on the other side of it has no intention of opening it again. "Whatever you are about to say, don't say it." Wren swallowed, nodded, stepped back. Lysara looked at her own reflection in the polished black shield mounted on the antechamber wall. 5 years of being Luna of the Iron Fang Empire had changed her face in ways that went deeper than age. The line of her jaw was harder than it had been when she arrived here as a 22-year-old Omega who had believed, genuinely and completely, that love was a thing that could survive politics. The shadows beneath her eyes were permanent now. The slight tension at the corners of her mouth had become structural, carved in by years of choosing her words carefully in rooms full of people who were always watching, always measuring, always waiting for a weakness they could name. She had not given them one. She had been meticulous about that. Except that she had. One. And it had nothing to do with weakness. She pressed her right hand flat against her abdomen. The fabric of her gray ceremonial robe was thick enough that no one would see the gesture from any distance. It was a private thing. The kind of private thing that had kept her sane for the past 7 weeks, through the whisper campaigns and the physicians' reports that had been altered before they reached the king, through the nights she had spent lying still and rigid beside Darius in the dark while he breathed in the direction of the ceiling and thought about things he never said aloud. 7 weeks. She had been calculating. She had been patient. She had been trying to find the right moment to tell him, trying to determine whether the right moment even existed, in a court where information was currency and secrets were weapons, and even the man you loved could be made into something you no longer recognized by the right combination of pressure and ambition applied to him at the right angles over long enough. She had waited too long. The drums stopped. The iron doors swung open. The throne hall of Vilethorn was 300 feet from end to end, built in the style of the old war kings who had believed that architecture could communicate power more efficiently than words. The ceiling vaulted 80 feet overhead, supported by columns carved from black granite, each one etched with the names of the dead who had built the empire. The floor was pale stone, washed in the red light that poured through the high lancet windows. Tonight, with the blood moon full and sitting low on the horizon, that light fell across the assembled court like something between a warning and an accusation. There were perhaps 200 people in the hall, high lords and their wives, military commanders in dress armor with their rank insignia polished to a mirror finish, representatives from the 3 vassal territories standing in their designated positions along the left wall. The chancellor, Gregor Vane, a man who had worked for the throne for 30 years, and whose loyalty Lysara had always found slightly too seamless to fully trust. And there, at the far end of the hall, elevated on the stone dais, Darius. She walked. This was the part she had prepared for. The walk, the controlled pace, the spine straight, the chin level, the eyes forward. Not defiant, not collapsed, just present, just here, just walking. It was the hardest kind of performance she had ever had to give because it required her to feel nothing visibly while feeling everything absolutely. She knew every face in this room. She had spent 5 years learning them, their loyalties, their resentments, their secrets, the particular quality of silence each of them maintained when they were hiding something. She had done this not because she was calculating by nature, but because she had learned early that in Vilethorn, you either learned the room or the room learned you first, and the second option tended to end badly. She did not look for sympathy in their faces as she passed. She found very little of it. Lord Edain Morrow, the most powerful voice among the High Lords, was watching her with the particular expression of a man who had already decided how he felt about tonight's outcome and was simply waiting for the official confirmation. Beside him, Lady Sorrel Morrow kept her eyes on the floor with a care that was itself a statement. Commander Ash Tolvar, the head of the Iron Fang's heavy cavalry, met Lysara's eyes briefly and looked away. She had always liked Tolvar. She had never mistaken that for protection. Celine Vorath stood near the right column, third from the front. Lysara noticed her the way you notice a splinter, not immediately, but with the delayed recognition of a specific located pain. Celine was 31 years old, the daughter of the late Duke of Vorath, and she had been a fixture of the court for as long as Lysara had been here. She was the kind of beautiful that looked expensive and tasted like strategy. She wore her dark hair pinned back with silver. Her eyes, which were a shade of pale gray that Lysara had always found deeply impersonal, were steady and unreadable as Lysara passed. She did not smile. She did not need to. Darius was standing when Lysara reached the foot of the dais. He should have been seated. Protocol required it. The king sat, the summoned stood, and the formal declaration was made from that geometrically unambiguous arrangement of power. The fact that he was on his feet was a deviation that Lysara's mind filed automatically as significant before the rest of her could process what it actually meant. He looked the way he always looked, which was to say, exactly like the man she had loved, and exactly like a stranger. 6'3", broad through the shoulders, the build of someone who had spent his youth in actual combat rather than in training yards, carrying the kind of physical weight that came from having a body that had been genuinely tested. The black iron crown of the Empire sat on dark hair cut close at the sides. His jaw was set. His eyes were what undid her, not because they were cold, but because they weren't. They were something worse. They were resolved. He had made a decision, and it was finished, and there was nothing left in his face that was still negotiating. Lysara Valcrest, he said. His voice carried without effort. It always had. In the early years, she had loved that about him. The way a room simply bent toward him when he spoke. The way silence fell, not because people were afraid, but because something in the frequency of his voice compelled attention. Now the same quality felt like a mechanism. Efficient, precise, aimed. "My lord," she said. "Luna," he said, which was a correction, and the correction had a dimension of cruelty to it that she doubted he intended, but that she felt nonetheless. He was reminding the court, and himself, of what she was before he removed it, establishing the record. "Stand before this court," he said. He was reading now, or reciting, the formal language, the archaic declaratory syntax that the Iron Fang reserved for the gravest matters. "Answer the charges of this inquiry." She had known there would be charges. She had known the shape of them for weeks. Even if she hadn't known the exact wording, she had been preparing. She had been preparing the way you prepare for a fall you can't prevent, not by trying to stop it, but by deciding how you're going to land. "Speak them," she said. "The office of Luna of the Iron Fang carries with it the obligation of continuation." He was not looking directly at her. He was looking slightly past her, at a fixed point above and behind her head. It was a technique. She had watched him do it in treaty negotiations when he didn't want the other party to be able to read his face in real time. The Empire requires heirs. The stability of the line requires heirs. 5 years of union have produced none. The hall was absolutely quiet.
Repeated inquiry by the court physicians, Darius continued, and his voice did not change, not at all, not one fraction, has produced consistent findings. You are unable to provide what the Empire requires. Lysara's hands were still steady. She thought, this is the moment. If I'm ever going to stop this, it's now. Tell him, say it now, in front of the court, before the formal declaration, before the words are spoken that cannot be unspoken. She thought about the 7 weeks. She thought about the slow-acting compound she had identified in her own blood work 3 months ago, the one that didn't show up in the standard physicians panel, the one that had required her to commission a private analysis from a healer in the lower city who owed her a favor and who she had sworn to silence. She thought about the report she had been building, piece by piece, cross-referenced and documented, building a case she had intended to place in Darius's hands at a moment of her choosing, in private, when she had enough to be believed. She had not finished building the case. She thought, he will not believe me without it. Not here. Not tonight, with 200 witnesses and the blood moon outside and every political weight in the Empire pressing down on this moment. If I speak now without proof, I am a desperate woman making a desperate claim, and the court will use it against me for years. They will say I tried to manipulate him. They will say I lied. She said nothing. It is the judgment of this court, Darius said, and the decision of the Alpha King of the Iron Fang Empire, that the union of this throne with the Omega Lysara Valacrest is hereby dissolved. The title of Luna is revoked. The rights and protections of the imperial household are withdrawn. You are to be escorted beyond the borders of the Empire before dawn. Someone, somewhere in the hall, exhaled. It was a small sound. It hit her like a stone. You will carry no title from this house, he said. No wealth from the imperial treasury, no guard. You are released from service. He paused. Then, with something that might have been deliberate and might have been automatic. No harm is intended you, only the necessary order of things. The necessary order of things. She looked at him. She waited until he was forced by the weight of the silence she was creating to actually look back. To look at her, directly, in the eyes, the way a man rather than a king. He did. For 3 full seconds he looked at her, and she absolutely saw, that there was something in him that was not resolved, not finished, not clean. There was something that was still alive in there, and that was going to cost him something, maybe for a long time. It didn't change anything, but she saw it, and she filed it, and she decided she would decide later what to do with that information. Is there anything you wish to say? He asked, and his voice dropped just slightly, and she understood that the slight drop was as much vulnerability as he was going to show in this room, in front of these people. She thought about everything she could say. She could tell him about the pregnancy. She could tell him about the poison. She could name Celine Vorath in front of the full court on the strength of incomplete evidence and watch the room tear itself apart trying to decide whether to believe her. She could weep, which she was absolutely capable of and absolutely refused to do. She could beg, which she would sooner die than do. She could tell him she still loved him. She could tell him that the love had not changed, that even now, standing here being publicly unmade in front of everyone, the thing she felt for him was still real and still present and still, stupidly, hers. She could tell him that and watch it do exactly nothing to the outcome. No, she said. She said it clearly. She said it the way you set something down that you are done carrying. Not with anger, not with ceremony, just with a clean, deliberate placement, and then your hands are empty, and you move. She turned. She walked back down the center of the hall, through the 200 witnesses, through the red moonlight, through the particular quality of silence that fills a room after something irreversible has been said aloud. She felt every eye in the hall on her back. She kept her pace even. She kept her shoulders straight. She walked through the iron doors, and she did not look back. Ren was still in the antechamber. The girl looked at Lysara's face, and whatever she saw there made her press her hand over her mouth. "Get my traveling cloak," Lysara said. "The gray one. The heavy wool." "My lady." "The gray one, Ren, and your own cloak as well. You're coming with me, or you're not, but I'm leaving in 20 minutes either way." She started walking toward her quarters. She had a bag already packed, had been packed for 3 weeks, just in case, because she had learned in 5 years in this court to maintain a condition of readiness that she hoped she would never need. She had packed it herself quietly over several nights, selecting only what mattered: the private documents in the sealed oilskin case, the dried travel provisions, the compass that had belonged to her father, the small wrapped bundle of herbs she would need in the coming months. The coming months. She pressed her hand against her abdomen again as she turned the corner into the corridor that led to the east residential wing. This time, there was no one to see the gesture, and she allowed herself one moment, just one, just this single corridor length of time, to feel the full weight of what was happening. Not what had been done to her. What she was going to have to do. She was 7 weeks pregnant with the Alpha King's children. She had not told him. She was now banished from the Empire in the middle of the night. The man responsible for all of this was the same man she had just watched read her formal dissolution off some official document without letting his voice shake. The people responsible for the poison that had been systematically destroying her fertility markers, methodically, over years, calibrated to produce exactly the results that had just been used against her, were still inside that hall, and she had no finished proof, and she was 20 minutes from the border. She had one move. She had always been someone who, when the available moves narrowed down to one, stopped grieving the lost options and started executing the remaining one with everything she had. Survive. Get out. Get north. Find ground where she could think without being watched. Build the case she didn't finish building. Come back with something more than a claim. She reached her rooms. She went straight to the wardrobe where the bag was hidden behind the winter linens. She pulled it out. She went to the fireplace and fed 3 pieces of correspondence into it, the kind that, in other hands, could have been used against her as evidence of sedition or disloyalty. Let them burn. She kept the oilskin case. She changed from the ceremonial robe into the plain riding clothes she had also prepared. Dark wool trousers, a thick woven shirt, the sturdy boots with the reinforced soles. She was lacing the second boot when the door opened. She did not reach for a weapon. She had one, the long hunting knife on the belt hanging by the door. But she did not reach for it, because if she was going to be killed in her own rooms tonight, a knife would not change the arithmetic, and she refused to perform desperation for an audience. It was Darius. He came in and closed the door behind him. He was still in his formal coat, the collar open now, the crown gone. He had given it to someone in the hall, apparently. Without it, his face looked more like the face she had known in the first year, the private face, the one that existed in rooms without witnesses. He looked at her boots. He looked at the bag. He looked at her face. "You were already packed," he said. "Yes." "How long?" 3 weeks. He absorbed this. His jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was working through something that he didn't have an immediate answer for. "Where will you go?" It was not a question she was going to answer. "That's no longer a matter for the Empire," she said. "I was told that." "Lysera, don't." The word came out the same way it had come out to Ren earlier. Quiet, final, a closed door. "Whatever you came in here to say, don't." "I'm not coming to take it back," he said. His voice was rough in a way it hadn't been in the hall. The hall voice had been controlled. This was something less controlled, something that had cost him something to find. "I know that's what you want me to say, and I can't say it. The court requires—" "I know what the court requires," she said. "I have been managing what the court requires for 5 years. I don't need you to explain it to me." "Then you understand this wasn't—" "Don't tell me what this was," she said, and her voice was level and it was devastating, and she knew it was devastating, and she made no effort to soften it. "Don't stand in my room in the middle of the night with your crown off and explain to me why you did what you just did. I was there. I watched it. I understand exactly what it was." He was quiet. She picked up her bag, slung it over one shoulder, went to the door and took the belt with the hunting knife off the hook and buckled it around her waist. Standard, practical. The gesture of someone who was about to be alone in territory where being unarmed was a form of stupidity. "The physician's reports," she said, and she turned back to him one final time because there was one thing she needed to say, and this was the only chance she would have to say it, not the full truth. She was not ready to give him the full truth yet, not without evidence, not in this room at this hour. But something. One thread that she could pull loose, one crack she could put in the wall of certainty he had built around tonight's decision. Ask Celine Vorath where she was on the nights the reports were filed. Ask her who she knows in the court physician's offices. Ask yourself why a woman with no formal role in succession policy has been present at every meeting where my status has been discussed. She watched his face. Something moved in it. Not disbelief, something more troubled than disbelief. The reflex of a mind that was, despite everything, genuinely intelligent, and that had just been handed a piece of information that didn't fit the shape of what he had decided tonight. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. I can't, he started. I know you can't, she said. Not tonight, I know. She paused. But you will think about it. You're thinking about it right now, and you will keep thinking about it, and I need that to be enough for now. She opened the door. Lysara. He said her name the way he had said it in the very beginning. The way he had said it before the court, and the politics and the years of pressure had compressed everything between them into something smaller and harder and more careful than what it had started as. Like it cost him something to say it. Like there was still something attached to it. She stopped with her hand on the doorframe. She did not look back. Take care of yourself out there, he said. It was inadequate. It was the most inadequate possible thing he could have said, and they both knew it. And he said it anyway because he had nothing else, and she believed against all the evidence of tonight that he meant it. I always have, she said. She walked out. Wren was in the corridor, gray cloak already on, carrying a second pack that was heavier than it needed to be. The girl had been sensible about it, had packed for real travel, not ceremony. Lysara approved. She didn't say so. She just walked, and Wren fell in step beside her, and they went out through the servants' entrance on the north side of the residential wing, into the rear courtyard, into the cold. The blood moon was directly overhead now, full and red and vast, the light it cast thick as paint, making everything it touched look like it was already over. The frozen stones of the courtyard were slick. Their breath came visible, twin plumes in the dark. The Empire, for the moment, was asleep or pretending to be. The north gate was unguarded. She had anticipated this, or rather, had anticipated that Darius would anticipate that she would need an unguarded exit and would arrange it. It was the kind of thing he did. The acknowledgement, the small facilitation, that stopped just short of actually being help. She walked through the gate and did not look at the guards who were very pointedly not there. Beyond the wall, the road north cut between dead fields. The Empire's agricultural territories were fallow this time of year, the ground iron-hard, the scrub grass pale and flat. The road itself was packed gravel, wide enough for 2 carts abreast, but there was nothing on it at this hour. No traffic, no torches, nothing moving in any direction except the wind, which came from the north with intention, cutting through the wool of her cloak and finding the skin beneath it. She walked. After 20 minutes, Wren said very quietly, "Are you all right, my lady?" "No," Lysara said. "All right." A pause. "Are you going to be?" Lysara thought about the child she was carrying. 3 children, actually. She had not told Wren that yet, had not told anyone, but the private healer had been clear about it, had shown her the markers, had said it with the careful, neutral face of someone delivering information so significant that they understood emotional editorializing would be inappropriate. 3. She was carrying 3, and they were healthy, and they were his, and they were growing in the dark of her body while the Empire decided she had nothing in her worth keeping. "Yes," she said. She said it the way she had been doing most things lately, not because she was certain it was true, but because she had decided to make it true, and decision was the only tool she currently had access to. They walked north. The road eventually became a track, and then the track thinned to nothing, and they were moving through open country by moonlight, using the stars and the compass from Lysara's father to hold their direction. The frozen ground was rougher here, the terrain beginning to lift toward the low foothills that marked the Empire's northern border. The blood moon had begun to descend. It would be gone before dawn. She thought about Celine Vorath standing by that column, the stillness of her, the quality of her watching, which had been more like accounting than witnessing, the expression of someone who was not merely observing an outcome but confirming it, receiving something long anticipated. She thought about the private healer's findings. The compound had been identified as a slow-releasing suppressant, a thing that altered the appearance of her bloodwork markers without causing symptoms obvious enough to investigate. The kind of thing that required knowledge, access, and patience. Not weeks of planning, years of it. This was not opportunism. This was architecture. Someone had designed the thing that had destroyed her life with the same care and deliberation you would bring to building a wall that had to hold weight. She filed this. She kept moving. 3 hours before dawn, they crossed the border. A stone marker, half buried in frost, carved with the Iron Fang sigil on one side and nothing on the other. The nothing side faced north. She crossed to the nothing side and kept walking. By the time the sky began to go gray at the edges, she had reached the first of the small northern settlements, a scatter of stone buildings around a central well, a place that didn't appear on any imperial map she had ever seen, which was something she had counted on. The people who lived in places that didn't appear on imperial maps had usually decided at some point to stop mattering to the Empire as an act of survival. She understood that impulse now in a way she hadn't before. Ren was exhausted and not complaining about it, which Lysara noted and credited. She found them shelter in a stable attached to the furthest building from the road, clean straw, no animals, a heavy door that latched. She made Ren lie down. Ren was asleep within minutes, with the immediacy of the young and the genuinely depleted. Lysara sat against the stable wall with her knees drawn up and her hands flat on her thighs. She was not going to sleep. Not yet. There was a calculation to be done, the kind that required the grinding work of sitting with all the pieces of a situation and being completely honest about their actual shape rather than the shape you wished they had. She was alone. She was north of the Empire with no title, no guard, no legal standing. She had documentation that was incomplete and a theory she could not yet prove. She was carrying 3 children who were, by the blood and the bone, the heirs of a throne that had just decided they did not exist. She thought about Darius's face in the moment before she walked out, the fractured thing she had seen behind the resolve, the crack she had put in it by naming Celine, by giving him the thread. It was not enough to build anything on yet. It would not be enough for a long time. But she was not going to wait for it to become enough on its own. She was going to go north. She was going to survive the winter in the territories beyond the maps. She was going to find the people who lived on the nothing side of Empire markers, and she was going to learn everything they knew about living outside the thing that had just expelled her. She was going to have her children in safety, and she was going to raise them knowing exactly who they were and exactly what had been done to them and exactly why it mattered. And then she was going to build something. She didn't know yet what shape it would take. She didn't know yet what she would need or who she would become in the process, or how long it would take the Empire to realize what it had done when it opened its gates and let her walk out of them. She didn't know the name of the force she was going to become. But she knew one thing with the clarity of someone who has had everything stripped away until only the essential truth remained, hard and clean and permanent. They had made a mistake. Not because she had been important to them. Not because they had lost something political. Because they had looked at her and seen a limitation where there was only potential they had not yet understood. Because they had seen an ending where there was only a beginning they had not yet been patient enough to wait for. The blood moon was setting behind the low hills. The light through the gap in the stable door went from deep red to gray to the pale watercolor white of pre-dawn. The world outside was silent and frozen and indifferent in the way that only real wilderness is. Not cruel, not kind, just present, just actual, asking nothing from her and offering nothing she hadn't already brought herself. She placed her hands on her abdomen. She felt the cold of her own palms through the fabric. She breathed. "I know," she said, so quietly it barely made it past her lips. She sat in the dark of the stable and she waited for dawn and she began, methodically, in the privacy of her own mind where no one had ever been able to follow her, to plan. 4 miles south, in the imperial capital of Vaelthorn, Darius Kyle Draven stood at the window of the Luna's vacated chamber. Her rooms, which still held the particular quality of air that belonged to someone recently gone, and looked at the space where a bag had not been, and heard, in the receding echo of his own memory, the deliberate steadiness in her voice when she had named Celine Vorath. He had not slept. He had not sent anyone after her. He stood at the window until the blood moon set, and then he stood in the ordinary dark, And then Gregor Vane knocked twice on the outer door and entered and said, in the careful voice of a man who understood that some mornings required a specific kind of professional neutrality, "My lord, the court convenes at second bell." Darius did not move from the window. "Find me everything we have on the filing records for the court physicians," he said. "The last 3 years, who filed, who authorized, who had access to the originals before they were entered into the official record." Vane was quiet for a moment. "That is a specific inquiry, my lord." "Yes," Darius said. "It is." Another silence, then, "It will take time." "Then start now." He heard Vane leave. He heard the door close. He stood at the window alone and looked out at the frozen north, at the empty road that ran straight to the border and beyond, at the country beyond the border that did not belong to him, where she was somewhere, walking away from everything he had built and owned and had been so certain about, into the dark and the cold and the great nothing that he had sent her into. He thought about the question she had asked him to ask. He thought about where Celine Voreth had been on the nights the reports were filed. He thought about the steadiness in Lysara's hands when she stood before the court, not the steadiness of someone with nothing to hide, the steadiness of someone who was protecting something, someone who had decided, for reasons he could not yet understand, to protect it from him. The realization moved through him slowly, the way that certain kinds of cold move, not a sudden shock, but a gradual, pervasive, bone-deep chill that you don't notice until you are already saturated with it and cannot get warm. She had been protecting something when she said nothing. She had had a reason to say nothing, and she had kept that reason, and she had walked out of his court carrying it, and he had let her go. He pressed his knuckles against the cold glass of the window. Outside, the first gray light of morning was beginning to touch the frozen fields. And somewhere north of the border, beyond his reach, beyond his authority, beyond every mechanism of power he possessed, Lysara Valacrest was already gone. And the thing she had been protecting was gone with her. God, 3,000 miles north, in the Shadowlands beyond the Frostbarrow Passage, a hunting party from the Vethkai borderlands found a woman and a girl collapsed in the snow at the edge of the tree line. The woman was gray-faced with cold, barely conscious, but her heartbeat was stable and her grip on the pack she carried was absolute. Even half frozen, she had not let go of it. The hunting party's elder knelt in the snow and checked her pulse and checked the girl's pulse and looked up at his people with the expression of someone making a calculation. "Bring them in," he said. The woman's eyes opened for a moment as they lifted her. They were the color of storm water, gray and still and focused, even in the fog of cold and exhaustion, with something in them that the elder would think about for a long time afterward. Not fear, not relief. Just the particular look of someone who is not finished yet. The elder's name was Herrick Veth, and he had been alive long enough to have stopped being surprised by most things. He had pulled people out of the northern snow before. Travelers who underestimated the Frostbarrow Passage, deserters from Imperial border garrisons, occasionally someone who had made an enemy they couldn't outrun. He knew what desperation looked like when it was wrapped in a body, and he knew what it felt like in a room, and he knew the difference between someone running away from something and someone running towards something they hadn't found yet. The woman in his sick room was the second kind. She had been conscious for 2 days now. She had eaten what was put in front of her, not gratefully, not with the shaky relief of someone rescued, but with the focused efficiency of someone fueling a machine that needed to keep operating. She had asked 3 questions in that time: where she was, whether the girl was all right, and whether there was anyone here who traded with the Empire's border posts. The first question she absorbed. The second she absorbed. The third one she held on to and returned to twice more, with slightly different phrasing each time, as though triangulating the answer she actually needed from the answer she was being given. Herrick sat across from her now in the low light of the sick room, a single oil lamp between them, and looked at the woman who had arrived at the edge of his territory, half frozen, with an oilskin case and a death grip, and eyes like winter water. "You're from Valethorn," he said. "I was," she said. "The coat, the boots, the quality of them, even worn out as they are." "I didn't say otherwise." "No." He laced his fingers together on the table. "You also didn't say your name." "Lysara." "Lysara." And he said it flat, just the sound of it, not a question. Running from the Empire or run out of it. The distinction mattered to him, and she understood immediately that it did. That in the borderlands, the two things had different implications, different risks, different obligations to the people who provided shelter. Running away from something suggested pursuit. Expelled suggested something cleaner, something that was already finished as far as the Empire was concerned. "Run out," she said, officially, formally, with full ceremony. On a blood moon night, she met his eyes. "You track the moons." "Everyone up here tracks the moons. It's not a luxury, it's a calendar." He paused. "Blood moon banishment. That's not a minor thing from the Iron Fang." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He let the silence hold for a moment. Outside, the wind moved against the building with a low, grinding pressure. The North did not ask about your feelings. That was one of the things she had noticed in the 2 days she had been awake, how completely indifferent the North was to everything human. The cold didn't care who you had been. The snow didn't register what you'd lost. There was something almost useful about that, if you were the right kind of person to find it useful rather than crushing. "What do you want here?" Herrick said. "A month," she said. "Maybe 6 weeks. Long enough to recover and plan. I won't draw trouble to you. The Empire considers this matter closed. There's no pursuit." "You're certain?" "Certain enough." She paused. "There's a girl with me who has no part in any of it. She needs the same. I saw her." He uncrossed his fingers and set his palms flat on the table. "She's already been put to work in the kitchen." She seemed relieved to have something to do with her hands. The faint thing that moved across Lysara's face was not quite a smile. It was the kind of expression that has the shape of one without the warmth. "That's Ren, yes. And after 6 weeks, I go north." He looked at her steadily. "North of here there is nothing. You understand that. Nothing you can build from, nothing that doesn't try to kill you." "I understand," she said, "that there's nothing on the maps. That's different from there being nothing." Herrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Vethkai don't owe the Iron Fang anything. We haven't since my grandfather's time, and we don't intend to start. But we also don't court their attention." "I'm not asking you to." "Then we understand each other." He stood. He was a tall man, heavier than he looked sitting down. The build of someone who had done physical work his entire life, and whose body had reorganized itself around that fact. He looked down at her from standing height with the expression of a man completing an assessment. 6 weeks. You earn your keep while you're here. You share what you know that's useful, and you don't keep things from me that could bring trouble to my people." "Agreed," she said. "On one condition." He raised one eyebrow. "What I'm carrying stays between us until I choose otherwise." The eyebrow stayed raised. His eyes moved to her midsection, briefly, clinically, the way a man who has lived in rough country learns to assess physical condition because it matters to practical outcomes. He arrived at the same place the private healer had arrived at, and his face did not change in any dramatic way, but something settled behind his eyes with the weight of additional information absorbed. "That is your business," he said. "Not mine." "Good," she said. He left her alone. She sat in the low light for a while, not moving. The lamp's flame was steady. The room was well sealed, which meant Herrick built things properly, which meant he was the kind of man who did work that was meant to last. That was worth something. She filed it. She put her hand on her abdomen. She thought 3. She thought alive. She thought mine. Then she thought about what that word meant, currently, in practical terms, with the Empire behind her and the blank North ahead of her, and 6 weeks in a border settlement as the entire substance of what she had to work with right now. It meant she was responsible for 3 lives that could not be responsible for themselves yet, which meant every decision from this point forward needed to be made by someone who had fully accepted that the version of herself that had walked into the throne hall of Violthorn last week was no longer the operating version. That version had believed in patience, in building a case, in the internal logic of institutions, that the right evidence presented in the right way to the right person would produce a just outcome because the person and the institution were, at their core, oriented toward justice. She was done with that, not because she had given up on the truth. The truth was still the only real weapon she had, And she was going to finish building the case, and she was going to deploy it eventually, when it was finished and when she had the standing to deploy it from. But she was done with the belief that the truth, on its own, was enough. Truth required power to land. Truth required a position it could be spoken from. Truth required that the person receiving it had more to gain from accepting it than from rejecting it. She was going to build that position. She had no idea yet what it looked like. She had the beginning of an idea about what it required: resources, people, ground she could hold, the north beyond the maps, the territories the Empire had decided were not worth governing, the people the Empire had decided were not worth counting. She thought about Celine Vorath, standing at that column, watching the closing of a door she had spent years building. She thought, "You should have made sure I was dead." She thought, "That was your mistake." Then she put that away because it was not yet time for it, and she had other, more immediate things to focus on. She got up. She was still stiff, still moving with the particular careful quality of a body that had been cold all the way through and was not yet entirely convinced the danger was past. She put her hand on the wall to steady herself for one moment, just one, and then she let go and stood on her own and walked to the door and opened it. The settlement was small, maybe 40 people, a cluster of buildings around a central working area, with a smokehouse and a smithy and what appeared to be a significant store of preserved food in a stone cellar that Herrick's people had been adding to all autumn. The kind of people who did not depend on the Empire for anything and had arranged their lives accordingly, who had understood, generations ago, that the only reliable form of security was the kind you built and maintained yourself. She stood in the cold air of the doorway and looked at it, and she thought, "This is the model. Not this settlement specifically, but this principle. This understanding that the thing you need, you build, or you do without." She was going to build. Wren found her 20 minutes later, standing at the edge of the settlement's northern perimeter, looking out at the tree line. The girl came up beside her without being asked and stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, which Lysara credited. "How are you?" Wren said finally. "Functional." "That's not the same as—" "I know it isn't." Lysara turned to look at the girl. Wren was 17, and she had followed an exiled woman into frozen wilderness in the middle of the night without being asked twice. And she was standing here now with red cheeks and steady eyes and no sign of the kind of regret that would have made her useless. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." "All right." "You can go back. Not to the palace, but to the capital, to find work. You're young, and you're capable, and you have no part in what happened to me. No one would hold it against you. The Empire's business with me is finished, and that means the Empire's business with you is finished too." Wren was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them. "Are you asking me to go?" Wren said. "I'm telling you that you can." "That's not what I asked." Lysara looked at the girl. "No," she said. "I'm not asking you to go." Wren nodded once. "Then I'm staying." She paused. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to spend the next 6 weeks learning everything these people know about surviving up here. Then we're going north." "North of here?" "Yes." Wren accepted this with the brief pause of someone absorbing a fact that is alarming but not disqualifying. "And then what?" "I don't have the rest of it yet," Lysara said. "But I'll have it by the time we need it." Wren looked at her and looked at the north and looked back at her and said, "All right." They stood at the perimeter in the cold for another moment. Then Lysara said, "Herrick put you to work in the kitchen." "I was useful," Wren said, with a hint of something defensive. "Go back and be useful again," Lysara said, "and find out what he knows about the supply routes that run along the northern edge of the Empire, casually, while you're being useful." Wren looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating what they thought they understood about the nature of their current situation. Then she said, "Yes, my lady," and went. Lysara turned back to the tree line. 3 weeks later, she knew the northern passages well enough to draw them from memory. She knew which of the Vethkai's contacts ran goods along the imperial border, and which of those contacts had reason to be dissatisfied with the arrangement. She had been useful in return. Her knowledge of the imperial court's internal structure, its supply chains, its political debts,
was more detailed and more current than anything Herrick had access to, and she shared it with the methodical generosity of someone who understood that information traded freely now was infrastructure for what came later. She had also, by the third week, begun to understand her own body's new math. The children were growing. She was managing it. The fatigue, the careful eating, the deliberate rest that felt like a concession but was actually a strategy. She was not going to be reckless with this. She was going to arrive at whatever came next still intact, still functional, still the operating version of herself.
On the morning of the 25th day, a rider came into the settlement from the south. He was imperial. The coat was wrong for the borderlands, too fine, too city-cut, and his horse was a quality that the Vethkai didn't keep, bred for speed on maintained roads rather than terrain. He came in openly, which was interesting, and he asked for Herrick, which was not surprising. And Herrick met him in the central yard with 4 of his people standing at the periphery in the casual, distributed way that meant they were ready for whatever this became. Lysera watched from the corner of the smokehouse with her hood up. The rider was young, 25 maybe. The kind of young that hadn't yet learned to keep his face entirely still. He spoke to Herrick quietly, but sound carried in cold air, and she was close enough. "Inquiry from the capital," the rider said. "Gregor Vane, Chancellor's office." Herrick crossed his arms. "The Chancellor's office doesn't send riders to the borderlands without a reason they're willing to state clearly." "Inquiry about a woman." The rider reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "If she's passed through, where she went." "Women pass through," Herrick said. He did not take the document. "This one specifically." The rider opened the document himself and held it up. "Lysera Valicrest, former..." "I know who she was." Herrick's voice was flat. "Why does the Chancellor's office want to know where she went? The Empire banished her. The matter was closed." "It's been reopened," the rider said. Lysera's breathing went very controlled and very quiet, with the practiced deliberateness of someone who needed to think clearly in the next 30 seconds. Reopened. Darius had done it. He had pulled on the thread she had given him, and it had led somewhere, and now Gregor Vane, which meant Darius because Vane did not move without Darius behind him, was sending riders to the borderlands looking for her. And she did not know, standing at the edge of the smokehouse in her too large borrowed coat, whether this was Darius trying to fix what he had broken, or Celine Vorath covering something she couldn't afford to leave loose. The distinction was critical, and she had no way to determine it from here. Herrick looked at the document. He looked at the rider. He uncrossed his arms. "I haven't seen the woman," he said. "Can't help you." The rider looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a young man who had been sent to find something and was calculating whether he believed the person telling him it wasn't here. Then he folded the document, put it back in his coat. The Chancellor's office would consider any assistance a matter of goodwill between the borderlands and the Empire. "The Vethkai appreciate goodwill," Herrick said. "Safe travels south." The rider left. Herrick did not look in the direction of the smokehouse. He walked back toward his own building and disappeared inside without breaking stride or doing anything that would indicate to a watching rider that he was about to have a conversation. Lysera gave it 10 minutes. Then she went to his door and knocked twice. "In," he said. She entered. He was standing at the far side of the room, pouring water from a kettle, not looking at her. "You need to leave," he said. "Not because I'm throwing you out. Because staying here 3 more weeks just became a risk I can't justify to my people." "I know," she said. He turned, looked at her. "Where will you go?" "North, tonight."
In the dark. "The moon's 3/4 full. It's enough." She met his eyes. "I need 2 things. Provisions for 3 weeks of hard travel, and a name, someone north of the Frostbarrow who I can find." He was quiet for a long moment, doing the calculation she could see him doing, what he owed, what he risked, what the thing he was looking at actually was, and what it might become. "Maren Voss," he said finally. "She runs a way station 2 days north of the Frostbarrow Passage. She is not a warm person. She will not welcome you." "I don't need warm," Lysera said. "I need someone who doesn't answer to the Empire." "She answers to nothing but herself," Herrick said, "which means she'll want something for whatever she gives you." "I have things to give." He looked at her. a long, assessing look that went past the surface of the borrowed coat and the practical boots and the controlled stillness of her face that went somewhere deeper, to the particular quality of intention she carried. He looked the way a man looks when he is trying to determine whether the thing he's dealing with is as significant as it appears to be, or whether he's reading gravity into something ordinary. Then he said, "You should know something. The rider who came, he's been here 3 days waiting. He arrived before you were conscious enough to be visible." The room went very still. "He came to the Vethkai first," Herrick said, "before checking any other settlements, which means someone in the capital told the Chancellor's office exactly which direction to start looking." She absorbed this. She absorbed the implication, which was precise and specific. Someone had told Gregor Vane, which meant either Darius or Celine or both, that she had gone north. Someone who had known.
Someone who had watched her walk out the north gate, or someone who had been told she would. Ren had been in that corridor. She put that away. She would consider it with the full attention it deserved when she had the physical space to do so. Right now, she had a departure to execute. "Provisions," she said. Herrick nodded and called for his supply person. 4 hours later, in the deep middle of a moonlit northern night, Lysara walked out of the Vethkai settlement with Ren at her side and a pack that was heavier than before, and a direction that was unambiguously north and no plan beyond the next 2 days of ground she had to cover. She walked. The cold was the specific brutal kind that existed up here. Not the manageable cold of the Empire's winter, but the real thing, the cold that had no interest in your survival and made no accommodations for it. It filled her lungs on the inhale, and the exhale was visible for a long time before it dispersed. The frozen ground under her feet was irregular, demanding attention, demanding that every step be placed with intention. She placed every step with intention. Ren walked beside her and did not speak, which was correct. There was nothing to say that would improve the walk or the situation, and Ren had already demonstrated she understood that. Somewhere behind them, a rider from the Chancellor's office was sleeping in a Vethkai guest room, preparing to continue a search that was running in the wrong direction. Somewhere further behind, in the capital, someone had already calculated where she had gone and had sent that calculation to Gregor Vane. She would need to understand who and why and what it meant about what Darius actually knew. She would also need to understand whether the man sending riders was trying to find her to bring her back or trying to find her to make certain she did not come back. The truth of that would determine everything about what she did next. She thought about Celine Vorath. She thought about the architecture of what had been done to her. The years of it, the patience of it, the complete confidence it must have required to build a trap that slowly and carefully and then simply wait for the target to walk into it. She thought about the quality of mind that produced that kind of plan. Detail-oriented, long-sighted, completely without scruple, but not without intelligence. She thought, "I'm going to need to be smarter than you." She thought, "I already am. You just don't know it yet." The moon was directly overhead, and the north was immense and silent and absolutely indifferent to all of it, and she walked through it with her hand on her abdomen for one moment. Just one. A private acknowledgement, a private promise. And then she put both hands back in her gloves and kept walking. 2 hours before dawn, she stopped. Not because she was tired, because something had changed in the quality of the silence around them. A shift in the texture of it, a difference in the way sound was moving. She put her hand out to stop Ren, and they stood very still, and she listened. Behind them, maybe a quarter-mile back, something was moving. Not wind, not animal. The rhythm was wrong for both. It was the rhythm of someone trying to move quietly through frozen terrain and mostly succeeding, except that the cold amplified sound in ways that even skilled people underestimated. Someone was following them. She looked at Ren. Ren's eyes were wide, but she was holding the stillness well. The girl was breathing slowly, deliberately, keeping her panic below the operational threshold. Good. Lysara's hand went to the hunting knife on her belt. She thought, one person, alone, based on the sound. Not a military pursuit. That would be louder, less careful, more confident. This was someone who did not want to be heard, which meant this was either a threat or a message. And there was currently no way to determine which without seeing the face. She thought about Herrick. She thought about the rider. She thought about the very specific quality of intention in the single set of footsteps behind her, and the calculation she'd made about Ren, and the name Celine Vorath, and the pieces of a situation that had suddenly rearranged themselves into a configuration she had not anticipated. She looked at Ren one more time. Then she stepped off the path, into the tree-lined shadow, and she waited. The figure that came through the moonlight 30 seconds later was not a soldier, not a chancellor's rider, not anyone she had been preparing herself for. It was a man she recognized, gray-coated, built for fieldwork, with the bearing of someone who had spent his career being invisible in exactly the way people who needed to send quiet messages required. His name was Soren Gale, and he had been, for the last 3 years, the personal intelligence courier for Darius Kale Draven. He stopped when he saw her step out of the shadows. He looked at her. He looked at the knife in her hand. He said, very carefully, "He knows." She held the knife steady. What does he know? Soren Gale reached into his coat and produced a small sealed letter. He held it out at arm's length in the moonlight, where she could see it clearly. The seal on it was not the imperial seal. It was the private mark Darius used on personal correspondence, the one that had no official existence, the one that meant the words inside were not from the Alpha King of the Iron Fang, but from the man underneath that title, the man she had spent 5 years trying to believe was still in there. "He knows," Soren said, "and he sent me 2 days after you left, and I've been tracking you since the Vethkai settlement, and he told me to find you and give you that and then do whatever you told me to do." Her hand was steady on the knife. Her breathing was even. She looked at the letter. She looked at the man. She thought about every possible interpretation of this moment and ran through them with the cold efficiency of someone who had stopped being able to afford the luxury of hoping before she finished thinking. "Whatever I told you to do," she repeated. Those were his words, Soren said. Exactly. She looked at the letter in his outstretched hand, and she thought about opening it, and she thought about what would be in it, and she thought about what it would mean if it was genuine and what it would mean if it was not. And she thought, it doesn't matter yet. What matters is what I do next. She reached out and took the letter. She did not open it. She put it in her coat against her chest, where it pressed against the oilskin case she had been carrying since Veilthorn. "Tell me," she said to Soren Gale, "what Gregor Vane found in the physician's filing records." He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something significant. "Everything," he said quietly. The North was silent around them. "Then we have a problem," she said. "Because if Vane has it, Selene Vorath knows he has it, and if she knows he has it, she will not wait." Soren opened his mouth. "Someone," Lysara said, cutting him off with a precision that stopped his words cold, "is going to die in that capital in the next 72 hours to make sure this stays buried. And the only question is whether it's Gregor Vane or whether Selene has decided she needs to aim higher." She watched his face. She watched the thing that moved across it. The specific quality of a man who has been carrying information and has just been told by someone else that information before he could deliver it. And she knew, in the instant before he confirmed it, what he was about to say. "It's not Vane," Soren said. "Last night, by the time I got to the Vethkai." He stopped. "Who?" she said. He said the name. The cold moved through her, not the kind from the weather, the deeper kind. The kind that comes when a situation you thought you understood reveals the actual shape of itself, the full dimension of it, the true distance between where you are and where you need to be, and the specific, irreversible cost of the road between them. She understood now, with complete clarity, exactly what Selene Vorath was willing to do, and she understood that the timeline she had been building, cautious, thorough, patient, was gone. The luxury of patience was gone. What was left was something more immediate, more dangerous, and entirely without a safe approach. She had been planning to come back with power she had built carefully, in her own time, on her own terms. She was going to have to come back with whatever she had right now. She looked at Soren Gale. She looked at Ren. Then she looked back the way they had come, south, toward the Empire, toward the thing she had walked away from, and the thing that was happening there right now while she stood in the frozen north making calculations. "How fast," she said to Soren, "can you get me back into that capital without the Chancellor's riders or anyone on Selene Vorath's payroll knowing I'm coming?" Soren looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Fast enough. But there is no quiet way to do what comes after. I know, she said. If you go back now, you can't leave again. There's no version of this where you ride in and ride out. You understand that. I understand, she said. Then yes, he said. I can get you back. She had left the Empire in the dark with nothing but a bag and a decision. She turned south. She was going back with nothing but a name, an unread letter pressed against her ribs, and the beginning of something that had no safe ending and no careful version and no option that did not require her to become, completely and permanently and without apology, the thing that the Empire had never prepared itself for. Not a victim, not a supplicant, not the woman they had expelled, something else entirely. Soren moved fast for a man who had been tracking through frozen terrain for 2 days. He knew the borderland routes the way someone knows a place they have used for survival rather than tourism. Not fondly, not with any particular attachment, just completely. He knew which frozen creek beds were load-bearing and which would drop you through into black water. He knew which ridgelines offered cover from the southern roads and which ones silhouetted you against the sky if the moon was at the wrong angle. He moved, and Lysara moved, and Ren moved behind them both, and none of them spoke, because Soren had made clear in the first 10 minutes that sound carried further than instinct suggested, and that the Chancellor's rider was not the only set of eyes Gregor Vane had positioned along the northern approaches. She thought about the name Soren had given her, Gregor Vane. Not an underling, not a courier, not someone peripheral who had been convenient and expendable. Vane himself, 30 years of service to the throne, the man who had organized the filing inquiry at Darius's direct instruction, the man who had apparently found what the filing records contained and had died before he could deliver it in a form that could be acted on. She had liked Vane. She had never trusted him completely, but she had respected the quality of his intelligence and the professionalism with which he operated. He had been the kind of man who understood that institutions required certain kinds of people to function, people who were loyal to the structure rather than to individuals, who kept things running when the individuals at the top were making catastrophic decisions. Celine had killed him within 24 hours of understanding that he was looking. That was the number she kept returning to. 24 hours. The speed of it communicated something specific, not panic, not reactive violence, but the decisive action of someone who had a contingency already prepared, who had, at some point, sat down and thought through the scenarios that represented real threat, and had identified Gregor Vane as one of them, and had already determined what she would do if that scenario materialized. This was not improvisation. This was a plan encountering its predicted complications and responding, which meant Selene's preparation extended further than Lysara had estimated, and the estimate she had been working from had already been alarming. They crossed back into the Empire's territory at a point Soren knew, a place where the border marker had fallen over decades ago, and no one had bothered to re-erect it, a gap in the official geography that was useful precisely because it had been forgotten. He moved them through it without ceremony, and they were on the imperial side of nothing in particular, and the road south opened in front of them in the gray pre-dawn light, and Soren finally allowed a brief stop. 4 hours to the first relay point, he said. He was barely breathing hard, which told her something about his condition and the kind of work he did regularly. From there, horses, we can be inside the capital's outer district by tomorrow night if we move. By the south gate or the east, Lysara said. East. The South Gate has checkpoint rotation that Vane supervised personally. Since his death, those posts report to the Deputy Chancellor, and I don't know yet where she sits on this. Who is the Deputy Chancellor? Appointed 8 months ago. Name is Karis Hale. She came up through Lord Morrow's administrative staff. Lysara absorbed this. Lord Adain Morrow, who had stood in the throne hall on Blood Moon night with the expression of a man waiting for an outcome he had already calculated. Lord Morrow, whose political alliance with Selene Vorath's faction had been a quiet but consistent feature of court dynamics for the 3 years Lysara had spent paying attention to such things. Eastgate, she said. Soren nodded and started moving again. She opened the letter while she walked. The light was just enough to read by. The gray blue of very early morning, flat and shadowless. The letter was short. Darius wrote the way he spoke when he was alone with her, in the private register rather than the formal one. Short sentences, direct, with the occasional construction that revealed the specific way his mind worked when it was working honestly. He had found the thread. He had pulled it. The filing record showed unauthorized access on 6 separate occasions over 3 years, always in the 2-day window following her quarterly physician examinations. He had names. He did not write the names in the letter because he was not yet certain the letter would reach only her, but he told her he had them, and he told her that Vane had confirmed the access pattern before he died. And he told her, in a sentence that was doing more work than its 7 words would suggest, that he understood now what he had done. The final line was, "Come back if you can. I will not make you." She folded the letter, put it back inside her coat. She thought about those 7 words, "I will not make you," and the specific weight they carried in the mouth of a man who had the institutional authority to make her do nearly anything. It was the most precise form of apology available to someone who could not undo what they had done and knew it. She thought about whether it was enough. She thought, it doesn't matter yet whether it's enough. What matters right now is that we have aligned interests for the next 72 hours, and aligned interests are the only reliable basis for any cooperation, and everything else is something to determine after the immediate threat is handled. She walked south. They reached the relay point by mid-morning, a way station that was nominally a grain merchant storage facility, but that Soren clearly used for other purposes. He produced horses from somewhere in the back, along with a change of clothes for both women that were plain enough to pass as traveling merchants' wives in the capital's outer districts. He produced food, which Lysera ate with the same mechanical efficiency she had been applying to eating for weeks. He produced, somewhat unexpectedly, a detailed hand-drawn map of the capital's current guard deployment. "How current?" she said. 3 days, he said. Vane's network. Parts of it. The parts that haven't gone to ground since his death. He put his finger on a point in the capital's government quarter. This is where it becomes a problem. The Imperial Records Building, where the physical copies of the filing documents are stored, has been under additional guard since yesterday morning, which means Celine knows the investigation reached the physical records and is securing them. "She's not destroying them," Lysera said. Soren looked at her. "She's securing them," Lysera said again. "Not destroying, there's a difference. She wants to control them, not eliminate them, which means she intends to use them for something." She looked at the map. "As leverage, against Darius." Soren was quiet for a moment. "That would require her to be planning a move against the throne directly." "Yes, Lysera said. "It would." The silence between them had a specific quality, the quality of a situation that has just revealed itself to be significantly larger and more immediate than the frame you had been using to understand it. "She's not waiting for you to come back," Soren said. "She's not running a defensive operation." "No," Lysera said. "She never was. I was the obstacle. I was the thing she had to remove to clear the path. The banishment wasn't the end of her plan. It was a prerequisite." She thought about the architecture of it, the years, the patience, the precision. She thought about a woman who had spent years removing an obstacle with the methodical confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was going to do once the obstacle was gone, who had always known, who had been working backward from an intended outcome rather than forward from opportunity. "How many people in the court know the filing records exist and what they contain?" she said. 3, Soren said. "Darius, myself, and whoever Celine has inside the records building. And Vane is dead." "Yes." "Which means Darius is exposed," she said. "He has the knowledge, but not the documentation. If Celine moves first and controls the physical records, she controls the narrative. She can present those records as evidence of whatever she chooses to frame them as." She looked at the map again. She looked at the government quarter. She thought about timing. "We need to be inside the capital tonight," she said. "Not tomorrow." Soren looked at the horses. "The roads will be watched." "Not all of them," she said. They rode. The capital appeared on the horizon in the late afternoon, the distinctive silhouette of it, the imperial spire catching the last flat light and throwing it back. She had not seen it from the outside before. She had arrived here 5 years ago from the south, welcomed, escorted, surrounded by the formal ceremony of a political alliance being sealed. She had ridden in through the main gate with a guard of honor.
She had been introduced to the assembled court. She had been given the title of Luna with a formality that had felt, at the time, like the beginning of something. Now she looked at the skyline from the east road and felt the specific sensation of someone returning to a place that had made them, not fondly, but with the complete attention of someone who understands that this particular place is going to require everything they have. Soren got them through the east gate with the papers he had prepared, presenting them to gate guards who were tired at the end of a long rotation and not inclined toward thoroughness. The city opened around them, the outer districts, the market quarters, the densely packed residential warrens of the eastern neighborhoods. The light was going. Torches were being lit. He brought them to a building in the trades district that had the unremarkable face of a legitimate business and the operational interior of something else. A safe house, the kind that had been used for years and was clean because it had been used carefully. He gave her the map. He gave her the key details of the guard rotation at the records building. He told her the contact inside Vane's network who was still operational and who could get her within reach of the physical files. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." She looked at him.
"The contact," he said. "The one still operational from Vane's network. The one who confirmed the access pattern and helped Vane build the file before he died." He paused. "It's Ren's older brother. He's a records clerk. He's been feeding information through Vane's network for 2 years." Lysera turned very slowly and looked at Ren. Ren's face was absolutely still. The particular still of someone who had known something was coming and had been waiting for the moment it arrived, and who was now in that moment and who had made a decision about how to inhabit it. "Ren," Lysar said. "Yes," Ren said. Her voice was steady. "My lady, how long have you known your brother was working for Vane?" "Since before I was assigned to your household." Ren met her eyes directly. "Gregor Vane arranged my placement. He wanted someone in your immediate household who could confirm whether the investigation's findings were accurate, whether the thing they suspected was actually happening to you." The room was very quiet. Lysera thought about the 17-year-old girl who had pressed cold hands against her cheeks in the antechamber outside the throne hall. She thought about the girl who had packed a second bag without being asked, and had stood at the north perimeter of the Vethkai settlement and said she was staying. She thought about every moment in the past weeks where she had read steadiness in Ren's face and had counted it as simple loyalty. "You were placed," Lysar said. "Yes. And the night of the banishment, following me north." "Vane told me to stay with you," Ren said. "He said if the investigation confirmed what he thought it would confirm, you were going to need someone." She paused. "He was right. He's dead now."
"I know." Ren's voice fractured slightly on those 2 words. "Not completely, but enough. I found out when Soren told you. I didn't know before." Lysara looked at her for a long moment. She looked at the girl who had been placed in her household as an intelligence asset, who had followed her into frozen wilderness, who had stood at the edge of the north perimeter and said, "I'm staying," without qualifying it, who was now standing in a safe house in the capital's trades district with steady eyes and a fractured voice and a brother inside the records building. She thought about the specific nature of the thing she was dealing with. Not a betrayal in the clean sense, not a weapon turned against her, but something more complicated. Someone who had been placed for purposes that had, somewhere in the execution, become something else. Someone whose loyalty had started as assignment and had, over the course of frozen roads and honest silence, become something harder to categorize. She did not know yet what to do with that. She filed it. "Your brother," she said. "What's his name?" "Aldrich," Ren said. "Can he get me into the records building tonight?" Ren blinked. "Tonight. The guard rotation changes at midnight. Soren says the west entrance has a 4-minute gap. I need someone on the inside to hold the archive room door for that window." She looked at Ren without softening anything. "Can your brother do that?" Ren was very still for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." "Then send word," Lysara said. "Now." She turned back to the map while Ren went to the door. Soren moved to stand beside her. He looked at the map. He looked at her face. "You're not going to send me," he said. It was not a question. "I need you outside," she said.
If this goes wrong, someone needs to get to Darius with the verbal account of what the files contain before Celine can move. That's you. You're not coming in with me. Then who? Me, she said. And Ren, if she chooses. He started to say something. I know, she said. I know what I'm walking into. I know what I'm carrying. Her hand moved briefly to her abdomen. Not dramatically, just a placement, a brief acknowledgement. That's exactly why I'm the one who has to do it. Because if something goes wrong in there and the files are lost, the only remaining evidence of what was done is in here. She pressed her hand flat. And I will not leave this to chance when I have the option to act. Soren looked at her with the expression of a man who has just fully understood the nature of the thing standing in front of him. He did not argue further. At 11:30, she moved through the trades district on foot, hood up, Ren at her shoulder, carrying nothing but the hunting knife and the oilskin case and the exact geometry of the records building's west entrance in her mind. The city was quiet at this hour. Not dead, but occupying the low hum of late-night commerce and winding-down activity that left the government quarter essentially empty. She had been inside the records building twice before, both times through the main entrance, both times on official business, both times accompanied by staff. She had paid attention both times because she paid attention everywhere, always, as a matter of practice. She had the floor plan in her head, with enough accuracy to navigate it in low light. She moved. Aldrich was 23 and looked enough like Ren that she recognized him before he said a word. He was standing at the west entrance with the specific expression of someone who had made a decision and was not confident it was the right one but was committed to it anyway. He looked at his sister. He looked at Lysara. He opened the door. The archive room was on the second floor. She moved through the dark interior with her hand on the wall, counting doors, feeling the geometry of the place match the map in her mind. The building smelled of old paper and lamp oil, and the particular cold that accumulated in stone buildings during winter nights. Her footsteps were quiet. Her breathing was controlled. She found the archive room. The door was locked with a standard iron mechanism, and she had the key. Soren had produced it, had not explained how, she had not asked. She opened the door. She went in. The files were organized by year and subject. She had a specific reference point from the information Soren had given her. She moved along the shelves with a small hooded lamp Aldrich had pressed into her hands, reading the index markers, finding the right section. She found the file. She opened it. It was there. All of it. The access logs. The compound analysis. Someone, Vane probably, had commissioned an independent analysis that matched precisely what her private healer had found. The dates, mapped against her examination schedule, showing the access pattern with a regularity that was not coincidence. The name that appeared on the access logs was a records clerk 3 levels below Selene Vorath in the court hierarchy. But attached to that name, in Vane's careful handwriting, was a notation. Retained agent, V family household, 10 years. 10 years. The relationship predated Lysara's arrival in Valethorn. Selene had been operating inside the court structure for 10 years with at least one placed agent in the record system. She pulled the documents she needed. She was precise about it. She took copies where copies existed, took originals only where there were no copies, noted what she was taking and why in a manner that would make the documentation coherent to someone reading it without context. She was on the third document when she heard the sound. Not footsteps. Voices, low and carrying, from the corridor outside. 2 of them. The particular cadence of guards who have deviated from their rotation for a reason, which meant either random and coincidental, or anticipated, or directed. She went completely still. The voices moved closer. She looked at the window. 2nd floor. The drop was manageable. She looked at the documents in her hands. 3 pages, critical, not yet secured. She looked at the door. The voices stopped directly outside. She heard the key in the lock. She moved. She went to the window, unlatched it, folded the 3 pages against her chest inside the coat, held the oilskin case in her left hand, and went through the window as the door opened. She caught the sill on the way down, controlled the drop, landed hard on the frozen ground below with a jarring impact that went straight up through her spine and stole her breath for 1 full second. She pressed herself against the building wall and did not move. Lamplight from the archive room above. the sound of someone moving inside. Then a voice, female, controlled, the specific vocal quality of someone issuing instructions rather than asking questions. She knew that voice. Celine Vorath was in the archive room. Lysara pressed her back against the cold stone of the building and counted her own heartbeats and thought, with absolute clarity, about what that meant. Not that Celine had been tipped off to the intrusion, there hadn't been time, but that Celine had come here tonight independently, for her own reasons, and those reasons were what Lysara had said they were: securing the files, not destroying them, taking possession. Which meant they had both arrived here tonight for the same documents, which meant Celine was 30 feet above her right now, looking at the evidence of what she had done, and the evidence was not gone, she had not destroyed it, which meant she intended to use it, to weaponize it, to reframe the narrative it told in a direction that served her. Aldrich was still inside. Wren was at the west entrance. She had 3 pages and the oilskin case and a hunting knife and a position against a frozen wall in the dark below an open window. Above her, she heard Celine say, clearly, in the specific tone of someone who has just found exactly what they expected to find. She was here. A pause. Then, find her. Lysara pushed off the wall and ran. She made it to the western alley before the first shout went up from the building behind her. She ran with the documents against her chest and the knife at her belt and the cold air burning in her lungs. And she thought about Aldrich, who was still inside, and about Wren at the entrance, and about the fact that Celine Vorath now knew she was in the capital, which changed every remaining calculation she had. She rounded the corner of the alley and stopped. 3 figures, not guards, private, plain-clothed, positioned with the professional distribution of people who had been waiting. One at each end of the alley, and one directly in front of her. The one directly in front stepped forward into the lamplight. She did not know his face, but she knew the type. She had seen it in Valethorn's underground, the kind of man who worked for money and had stopped requiring justification for the work. The documents, he said. She held the knife. She thought, 3 of them, one of her. She was carrying 3 lives in her body and 3 pages of evidence in her coat, and the only remaining physical record of what had been done to her family. She thought, there is no version of this that ends well if I try to fight my way out. She thought, there's also no version of this where I hand over what I'm carrying. She looked at the man in front of her, and she looked at the 2 at the ends of the alley, and she made a calculation so cold and so complete that she barely recognized the part of herself that made it. Tell Celine Vorath, she said, clearly and without performance, that I have already copied these. Tell her the copies are in 3 separate hands outside this city, and that if anything happens to me or to anyone connected to me, those copies go directly to every High Lord in the Empire simultaneously. The man looked at her. Tell her, Lysara said, that she should have made sure I was dead when she had the chance. She watched his face. She watched the calculation move through it. The specific calculation of a man who has been given an instruction and is now in a situation that the instruction did not fully account for. He stepped aside. She walked through. She walked with even steps and a straight spine and both hands visible, the knife sheathed, the documents against her chest, through the gap where the man had been, past the figure at the far end of the alley who also stepped aside. Not because she had convinced them, but because she had introduced a variable they had not been authorized to resolve. She cleared the alley. She did not run. She walked into the dark of the trades district, and she thought about the lie she had just told. There were no copies. There were no 3 separate hands. She had been in this city for 6 hours, and she thought about how long that lie would hold before Celine Vorath determined its shape, and she calculated the number of hours she had before the thing she had just done became the most dangerous thing she had ever survived. Fewer than 12. She turned toward the address where Soren was waiting, and she thought about Darius in the palace on the other side of the city, and she thought about the 3 lives growing in the dark of her body, and she thought about the specific moment a woman stops calculating her survival and starts calculating her offensive, and she understood, with the cold and final clarity of someone who has just crossed a line they cannot uncross, that she had just arrived at that moment. She was no longer in exile. She was no longer running. She was in the capital with evidence in her coat and a lie buying her hours, and a king who had sent her a letter that said, "Come back if you can," and she was back, and nothing about what came next was going to be patient or careful or managed from a safe distance. She walked, and somewhere behind her, in the archive room on the second floor of the records building, Celine Vorath stood over a shelf of documents that were less complete than they had been 20 minutes ago, and understood, for the first time, that the thing she had built her entire plan around eliminating had come back. And it had come back as something she had not prepared for. Soren was at the door before she reached it. He looked at her face and did not ask questions. He pulled her inside, closed the door, dropped the bar. He looked at the documents pressed against her chest. He looked at the knife still at her belt, unbloodied, which told him something about how the alley had resolved. His eyes asked the question, his mouth didn't. Celine was there, Lysara said, in the building, in person. He absorbed this with the stillness of a man recalculating everything simultaneously. She knew. She didn't know about me. She came for the files on her own timeline. Lysara moved to the table and laid the documents flat, which means she's accelerating. Whatever her move against the throne looks like, she's moving it forward. She looked up. Where's Ren? Not yet back. She felt it, a cold compression in her chest that was not fear exactly, but was the specific sensation of a variable she could not control. She pushed it down. Aldrich. Also not back. She looked at the documents. She looked at the door. She thought about the lies she had told in the alley. No copies, 3 separate hands, and the hours it would hold before Celine mapped its dimensions. She thought about Celine standing in that archive room, understanding that the evidence was incomplete and that the person who had completed it was inside her city. I need to get to Darius, she said. Tonight. Soren looked at her with the expression he had been maintaining since the Frostbarrow. The expression of a man who has accepted that he is operating in the presence of something that moves faster than his available frameworks. The palace is locked down since Vane's death. Personal guard doubled. Entry protocols tightened. You got in and out to find me. I used 3 days to prepare that movement. We have 3 hours, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, there is one way. The old drainage channel under the east wall. It hasn't been used operationally in 15 years, and it's not on the current security assessment. Vane showed it to me once, years ago. He paused. It's tight, it's cold, and there is a point in the middle where you have to go through water. She looked at him. I know, he said. Can you get me through? Yes. Then that's what we're doing. The door opened. Ren came through it, fast, with Aldrich behind her. Aldrich's face was cut above the left eye. Not badly, but fresh, still bleeding in the thin, precise way of a wound that had been moving when it was made. He was breathing hard. He looked at the documents on the table, and something in his face went from taut to slightly less taut. They made me when I came out, he said. 2 of them at the service entrance. I ran. Did they follow you here? No. He was certain. I know this district. I used the mill passage. She looked at his eye. She looked at Ren, who was looking at her brother with the particular expression of someone who is managing terror by focusing on the immediate practical question. She looked at both of them, the placed girl and the records clerk who had been feeding information into a network for 2 years, who had both, in their different ways, been working toward the same thing she had been working toward without any of them having a name for what they were building. Aldrich, she said, I need you to do something difficult. He met her eyes. All right. Take one of these documents. She selected the access log, the one with the agent's name and Vane's notation about the 10-year relationship. Not the original. Aldrich, look at me. He looked. You copy this in your own handwriting as a clerk's transcription. You sign and date it. You put your own name to it as witness, and then you take it to Lord Commander Tolvar personally, not to his staff, to him, in person, before dawn. Aldrich was still. Tolvar. He's not aligned with Morrow. He's never been aligned with Morrow. She thought about the cavalry commander who had met her eyes in the throne hall and looked away, and what that had contained, not complicity, not satisfaction, something more uncomfortable and honest than either. He is the kind of man who needs one thing to act, evidence he can hold in his hands. Give him this. Aldrich looked at his sister. Ren said, Go. He went. Soren was already preparing what they would need for the drainage channel: rope, a small hooded lamp, dry cloth for after the water crossing. He moved with the efficiency of a man who was fully committed to an operation and had stopped reserving mental space for doubt. She appreciated that about him. She had no space for doubt either. She secured the remaining documents inside the oilskin case and sealed it. She thought about the 3 children growing in the dark of her body, and she thought about the water crossing in the channel, and she thought about calculated risk. The specific calculus of a situation where the risk of inaction was larger than the risk of action, and where the body carrying the risk was also the only body capable of executing the action. She had been making this calculation for weeks. She was going to keep making it until it resolved. They moved out at midnight. The drainage channel was everything Soren had described. Low, stone-lined, wet with the specific cold damp of underground water that had been moving through frozen ground. The lamp threw a small circle of light that made the dark outside it more complete. She moved bent at the waist, hand on the stone wall, one foot and then the other, counting Soren's footsteps ahead of her. Ren was behind her. None of them spoke. The water crossing was mid-thigh deep and cold enough to stop the breath. She went through it with the oilskin case held above her head, and her jaw set and her mind on the other side of it, not on the cold, because the cold was temporary and what was on the other side was not. They came up through a grate in a storage room in the palace's eastern service wing. Soren replaced the grate behind them. They stood in the dark and dripped on the stone floor, and Lysera pressed the dry cloth against her legs and moved the cold through her body by will rather than waiting for it to move on its own. "3rd floor," Soren said quietly. "North corridor, that's where he'll be." She knew the north corridor. She knew the room at the end of it. She had lived in the rooms adjacent to it for 5 years. They moved through the service passages with Soren leading and Lysara memorizing the route as she walked, cataloging the differences between the palace she had known and the palace as it was now, post-Vane, under Titan protocols. 2 additional guard posts in the main residential corridor, a checkpoint at the stairwell entrance that hadn't existed before. She noted them and routed around them through the back passages that the service staff used and that the new security assessment apparently had not fully accounted for. 3rd floor, north corridor. She stopped Soren with a hand on his arm. She looked at the corridor, the length of it, the 2 guards at the far end outside the king's study, the quality of light under the door. He was awake. At this hour, with that light, he was awake. "Wait here," she said. Soren looked at her. "Both of you," she said. "This part is mine." She walked the north corridor alone. The guards saw her when she was 20 feet away. She watched the recognition move through them. The specific sequence of it, first the assessment of a stranger, then the recalibration as the face registered, the confusion as the context failed to resolve properly. She had been banished. She should not be here. And yet she was here, and she was walking toward them with the particular quality of someone who has not come to ask permission. "My lady," the left guard started. "Tell him," she said, without breaking stride, "that she came back." They looked at each other. The right guard reached for the door. She was at the door before he could knock. She opened it herself. Darius was at the window. The same north-facing orientation, a version of the same position she had found him in across the last 5 years at hours when he could not sleep, and the weight of what he was carrying had driven him to vertical. He turned when the door opened, and she saw, in the half-second before his face reconfigured into something more controlled, the raw impact of her standing there. Not surprise exactly, something more fundamental than surprise, the recognition of something he had convinced himself was lost. She closed the door. "You read the letter," he said. "Yes." "You came back." "You said come back if I could." She looked at him. "I could." He crossed the room in 4 strides, and she held her position, not retreating, not moving toward him either, and he stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her with the full unguarded weight of a man who had spent weeks in the specific torment of knowing exactly what he had done and having no mechanism to undo it. She did not give him the moment he needed. There was no time. "Celine is moving tonight," she said. "Whatever she's planned for the throne, it's accelerating. She was at the records building in person 2 hours ago." She opened the oilskin case and put the documents on his desk. This is what Vane found. This is what I pulled before she got there. The access logs, the compound analysis, the agent notation. It's complete. He looked at the documents. He looked at her face. Lysara. Read it later, she said. Right now I need to know. Who in your current guard is yours, completely, without any vector tomorrow or Vorath? He came back to the present with visible effort. The effort of a man pulling himself out of something personal and into something operational because the operational thing was what the moment required. She had always respected that about him, the ability to do that, and she respected it now even while she was the one requiring it of him. Tolvar, he said, 12 of the heavy cavalry officers. My personal guard, 6 of them. I sent Aldrich to Tolvar 20 minutes ago with a copy of the access log. Something moved in Darius's face. He was recalibrating again. The specific expression of someone who has sent a courier to find a person and has just understood that the person had gotten there first by a completely different route and was already several moves ahead. Where are the children? She said. He went very still. The stillness was different from his other stillnesses. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing his expression, but the stillness of someone who has been hit in a place they were not braced for. He looked at her, and he looked at her hand where it had moved without her entirely deciding to move it, flat against her abdomen, and he did the mathematics of 7 weeks and the northern months, and what she was standing in front of him carrying right now. She watched him understand. She watched it go through him, not quickly, not cleanly, but completely, the way water goes through stone over time, finding every crack and filling it. She watched the full dimension of what he had done, and what he had nearly destroyed, arrive in his face all at once with a weight that physically moved him. He stepped back 1 step, and then stopped, and stood with it. Lysara, he said, and his voice was nothing like the voice in the throne hall. They're fine, she said. And then, because it was the truth, and the truth was what she had, 3. The word landed. He sat down, not in the formal way, not in the controlled way, but in the way of a man whose legs have made a decision that the rest of him wasn't consulted on. He sat in the chair behind the desk, and he put his hands flat on the surface, and he looked at them. She gave him 4 seconds. That was what was available. Darius. Her voice was steady and direct and not unkind. I need you to function. I need you to function right now, tonight, because we have hours before Selene moves, and she is going to move against this throne and against these children, and everything we do in the next 4 hours determines whether there is anything left to save. She paused. Can you do that? He looked up at her. Yes, he said. And the thing she saw in his face, beneath the devastation, beneath the reckoning that was going to take a very long time, and a great deal more than tonight to complete, was the same thing she had seen in the throne hall on Blood Moon night, when she had named Selene and watched the crack form in his certainty, the thing that had been alive in there and had not died, the part of him that was still capable of doing right by something if someone gave him the mechanism. She gave him the mechanism. She put the documents in front of him, and she told him exactly what each one demonstrated and exactly what Tolvar would need from him in terms of formal authorization and exactly where the physical records building's guard would need to be redeployed to prevent Selene from removing or destroying what remained. He listened. He asked 2 questions, both precise. He signed the authorization she needed. Then the window exploded inward. Not broken, blown, deliberately, with the specific force of something designed for entry rather than damage. Glass across the floor, cold air. And through the frame, moving fast, 2 figures in plain dark clothing who were inside the room before the sound had finished. Darius was up and moving before she processed the order to move, putting himself between her and the entrance point, which was, she noted it and filed it in the same fraction of a second. Instinctive, not calculated. His body had made that decision without consulting the part of him that had stood in the throne hall and spoken the words of dissolution. She had the knife out. She was behind the desk, between the desk and the wall, with the oilskin case still in her left hand. The 2 figures were not there to fight. They were there to deliver something. The first one, the larger one, held up both hands, empty, in the gesture that universally means I am not your immediate problem. The second one was carrying a folded note and nothing else. From Lady Vorath, the first one said. Read it now. She says you'll want to read it before you do anything else. Darius looked at Lysara. She looked at the note. She took it. Opened it. 2 sentences. Celine's handwriting, which she recognized. Precise, slightly forward-leaning, the hand of someone who wrote with intention. The first sentence said, I have the girl. The second sentence said, you have until dawn. Lysara read it twice. She thought about Wren, who she had left in the service passage with Soren. She thought about the 30 minutes it had taken to navigate to the 3rd floor. She thought about Celine's network inside the palace, which she had known was there in the abstract and had apparently underestimated in the specific. She looked up. She looked at Darius, who was reading the note over her shoulder, and she watched the thing in his face that had been barely held together in the last 10 minutes fracture completely and then reconstitute itself as something she had not seen in him before. Not the controlled resolve of the throne hall, something rawer and more dangerous than that. The specific expression of a man who has understood that he has one thing left to lose and that someone has their hands on it, and that every instinct he possesses is now fully, entirely, and completely oriented toward a single purpose. She had seen that expression on other men's faces. She had never expected to find it useful. She folded the note. She put it in her coat. She looked at the 2 messengers who were still standing with their hands visible, watching both of them with the careful eyes of people who understood they were in a room with something significantly more volatile than they had been briefed on. Tell her, Lysara said very quietly, that we'll come to her. Tell her to pick a place. The messenger looked at Darius as though checking whether this was also his answer. Darius said, what she said. They left through the window. Lysara stood in the cold air coming through the broken frame and looked at the glass on the floor and thought about the specific geometry of what was coming, the trap that was being set, the obvious quality of the trap, the fact that it didn't matter that it was obvious because there was no version of the next 4 hours where she did not walk into it. She thought about Wren, 17 years old, who had packed a second bag without being asked. She thought, I'm going to get her out. I'm going to get her out, and I'm going to end this tonight. And the manner in which I end it is going to depend on what tools I have when I get there. And the only tool I know for certain I have is the specific thing I have been since the moment I walked out of the north gate in the dark. Not patience, not documentation, not the slow, careful building of a case. The willingness to walk into the thing that wants to destroy you, with nothing but what you've earned and not look away. Darius was at her shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. He was looking at the same nothing she was looking at, and she did not know what he was seeing in it, but she knew the quality of his breathing. Controlled, deep, the specific rhythm of someone who has made a decision and is holding it. She's going to use Wren to get you into a contained space, he said. She wants you and the evidence in the same room so she can close it. I know. She'll have the blood magic ready. He paused. The phrase blood magic carried its own weight in the Empire's context. The old working, the kind that the court's original founders had used and banned and buried in the legal codes precisely because of what it did to bloodlines, to inheritance, to the continuity that held thrones together. Celine had access to it through the Vorath family's oldest holdings. Everyone knew it existed. No one had used it in a generation because the cost was too high and the legal consequences were absolute. She's not going to trial. She's going to eliminate. Yes. If she gets you both in a contained space with the blood working ready, there is no scenario where it ends well. I know, she said. He turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. They were standing in the cold of the broken window in the north corridor room in the middle of the night, and he looked exactly like himself. And she looked exactly like herself, and between them was every version of 5 years, and every word spoken and unspoken, and every decision made badly, and every cost still being paid. I'm coming with you, he said. She looked at him. Not as the king, he said, not with the crown and the guard and the formal authority. As the person who stood at a window for weeks not sleeping and understood too late that he had thrown away the only thing in this empire that could not be rebuilt. He held her eyes. I am coming with you, and I am not asking your permission, and I understand if that does not change anything, and it does not matter whether it changes anything, I am coming. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought, he means it. She thought, that is not sufficient to undo anything. She thought, it is, however, sufficient for tonight. Then get Tolvar, she said, and the 6 personal guards, and whatever Aldrich gave him. She turned back to the room and picked up the oilskin case from the floor where it had landed when the window blew. We have 4 hours before dawn, and I need to know exactly where Celine is going to tell us to come. As if in answer, the knock came at the door. Not a messenger this time. One of Soren's people. A face she didn't know. Young, breathing hard from running, holding a folded paper. She took it before Darius could. One word. An address. The Imperial Spire. The oldest structure in the capital. The original seat of the Empire's founding. A building that had not been used for formal function in 40 years, and that sat at the center of the capital's government quarter like a fist made of stone. Sealed. Remote. Structurally compromised in the upper floors from a decade of neglect. Contained. She folded the paper. She thought about the blood working, and the upper floors, and the structural compromise, and a woman who had been planning this for 10 years, and who had, tonight, made the move that brought everything to its single necessary point. She thought about Ren. She thought about 3 children who did not yet have names. She thought about the specific nature of what she had become in the months since the blood moon. Not through intention, not through ambition, but through the grinding, unglamorous, absolutely necessary process of discovering what remains of you when everything constructed has been stripped away. She thought about what was left. She thought about whether it was enough. She decided it was going to have to be. She turned to Darius. Tell Tolvar to surround the building, she said. Every exit. I don't want her walking out of there under any circumstances. She paused. And tell him to keep the perimeter back. Whatever happens inside that building in the next 4 hours, I need it to happen without an audience. Lysara. Tell him, she said. She was already moving toward the door. Behind her, she heard Darius give the order. She heard it the way you hear something through water, muffled by the specific focus of a mind that has already committed to the thing it has committed to and is no longer available for the peripheral. The Imperial Spire was waiting. Celine Vorath was waiting. And somewhere in that building, in a room that smelled of 40 years of sealed stone, a girl who had packed a second bag without being asked was waiting to find out whether the woman she had followed into the frozen north was going to come through a door. Lysara walked out of the north corridor room. She did not look back. The Imperial Spire smelled of 40 years of sealed stone and the particular cold that accumulates in places that have been closed against the living for long enough that the stone itself forgets warmth. Lysara went in through the ground floor entrance with Darius at her left shoulder and the hunting knife in her right hand and the oilskin case secured against her body. Tolvar's people were outside. She had heard them taking position as she crossed the government quarter, the quiet, distributed sound of trained soldiers moving into a cordon. Inside the building, there was none of that. Inside, there was only the dark and the smell and the sound of their own footsteps on stone that had not carried footsteps in a generation. Darius had a torch. He held it low and forward, throwing light on the floor ahead rather than up into the vaulted ceiling where the shadows were absolute. He moved the way she had watched him move in the first year, before the court had fully compressed him into its preferred shape, with the physical directness of someone who had learned to occupy space through actual use rather than ceremony. She thought, this is the man who was always in there, under the crown and the formal coat and the carefully managed distance. This is what remains when the institution is stripped away, and the only thing left is the immediate operative question of what you are willing to do for the thing that matters. She had loved that man. She had spent 5 years trying to find him inside the other version. She filed that. There was a room at the top of this building and a woman in it and a girl who needed to walk out of it, and everything else was for after. The stairwell was narrow and went up 4 floors in a tight spiral. Stone dust had accumulated on the treads. The torch threw moving shadows that made the walls appear to breathe. On the second landing, Darius put a hand on her arm, set brief, not restraining, just contact. And she stopped and listened. Above them, something was moving. Not footsteps. A lower frequency. A vibration in the stone itself. the particular resonance of something being worked in the upper floors, a sound that the bone registered before the ear processed it fully. She had heard descriptions of blood working before. In the academic context of the Empire's legal history, in the dry language of prohibition and consequence. She had never been this close to it in active use. She started moving again. The fourth-floor landing opened into the spire's original council chamber, a circular room with a domed ceiling 30 feet above, empty of everything except the light. The light was the wrong color. It came from no visible source, and it was the deep amber red of something burning that had no fuel and no smoke, that existed purely as the byproduct of a working in progress. It threw shadows that moved against the direction of the room's geometry. It made the temperature feel lower than it was. In the center of the room, Ren was on her knees, not hurt, not yet, or not visibly. Her hands were bound behind her, and her head was up, and her eyes were open. And when she saw Lysera come through the door, something moved in her face that was not quite relief, because relief implies the danger is past, and Ren was 17 and intelligent, and she understood clearly that the danger was not past. Celine Vorath stood at the far arc of the circular room with her back to the curved wall and her hands visible and the working moving in the air around her in the way that active workings move. Not dramatically, not with theatrical display, but with the quiet, meticulous quality of something that has been prepared over a long time and is now simply executing. She looked at Lysera. She looked at Darius. She looked at the space between them, the operational distance, the positioning, the fact that they had come in together rather than separately, and she absorbed this with the expression of someone whose plan has encountered a variable, but whose confidence in the plan's fundamental architecture remains intact. "You came together," she said. Her voice was even, conversational almost. "I wasn't certain you would." "Here we are," Lysera said. "The documents," Celine said. "You have them?" "Yes." "Then you know everything." She said it without particular inflection, not a question, the statement of a woman who has been found out and has already moved past the phase of the situation that involves denial. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," Lysara said. "Long enough to document it. Long enough to have copies in other hands." The lie was still holding. She kept her voice level and let it hold. "Long enough that killing me tonight accomplishes nothing except confirming every detail in those documents." Celine looked at her with a careful, assessing quality. "You're bluffing." "Possibly," Lysara said. "Try me." The working in the air shifted. The amber light deepened by a fraction. Ren's head dropped slightly and then came back up. Not a physical pressure, something more specific than that, the effect of the working on a body in its proximity. Lysara tracked this and kept her face still. "I want you to understand something," Celine said. She moved slightly along the wall's arc. Not toward them, just repositioning, the way someone moves when they are making a point rather than an approach. "I want you to understand it clearly, because you are not a stupid woman, and I have never thought you were. What I built for the Empire, not for myself, not from ambition in the small personal sense." "Tell me," Lysara said. "Darius was going to destroy this throne," Celine said. "Not through malice, through the specific blindness of a man who had the instincts of a leader and the emotional architecture of someone who was going to let a single personal attachment override every institutional necessity. You were the attachment. You were going to be the reason this empire fractured. I saw it happening in real time, and I removed it." The room was very quiet. Darius said, "You poisoned her." "I corrected a trajectory," Celine said. "You poisoned her for 3 years," he said. His voice was the specific flatness of a man holding something back through pure structural effort. "You falsified the medical records. You used my court and my physicians and my trust in you as mechanisms to destroy the woman I—" He stopped. "The woman you were willing to destabilize an empire for," Celine said. "Yes, that's exactly what I prevented." "You decided," Lysara said. Her voice was quiet, and it cut through the room with a precision that silenced everything around it. "You decided, alone, over 10 years, what this empire needed. You decided what could be sacrificed and what couldn't. You decided I was the variable that needed to be eliminated, and you went about eliminating me with the patience and the methodology of someone who had never once considered that the decision itself might be wrong. She looked at Celine steadily. That's not loyalty to the Empire. That's the most dangerous kind of arrogance, the kind that wears loyalty as its justification. Something moved in Celine's face, the first genuine movement since they had come through the door. Not anger, something more conflicted than anger. The expression of a person who is hearing an accurate description of themselves and is encountering, possibly for the first time, the specific discomfort of accurate self-recognition. It lasted 2 seconds. Then her face closed again. The working is already set, she said. I want you to know that. It's been building since before you arrived. It will complete whether or not I actively direct it at this point. She looked at Lysera. Give me the documents. All of them. The originals and whatever copies actually exist. Give them to me, and I stop the working and you walk out of here. And the children, Lysera said. Celine's eyes moved to her abdomen. She had known, of course she had known, she had access to the physician's network for a decade. She had known before the banishment, which meant she had known when she arranged the banishment, and had calculated that removing Lysera removed the pregnancy without requiring anyone to acknowledge the pregnancy existed. The children complicate things, Celine said. Yes, Lysera said, they do. They are the Alpha King's heirs, Celine said, which means they are leverage for whoever holds them. They are not leverage, Lysera said. They are not political instruments. They are not variables in your calculation. Her voice was still quiet. It was the specific quiet of something that has gone past anger into a register that is much harder to negotiate with. They are mine, and you will not speak about them as though they are pieces on your board. The working surged, the amber light flared, and Ren made a sound, brief, cut short, and Lysera moved. She crossed the room in 4 strides, not toward Celine, toward Ren, going to her knees on the stone floor beside the girl and getting the knife between Ren's bound wrists in one motion. The rope cut. Ren pulled her hands free, and Lysera put her hand on the girl's face for 1 second. Not gently, with purpose, checking her eyes, checking her focus. Can you stand? Lysera said. Yes, Ren said. Then get to the door. Ren stood. She moved. The working hit Lysera like a pressure change, not a physical impact, something more internal, a sudden compression in the chest and a roaring in the ears, and the specific sensation of something trying to rewrite the boundaries of the body from the inside. She stayed on her knees for a moment, hand flat on the stone floor, using the cold of the stone as a reference point because her body needed a reference point to orient against what the working was doing. She heard Darius move behind her. She heard the collision of bodies, 2 of them, because Celine had not come alone. She had never come alone. The figures in the room's shadows that Lysera had noted on entry and had not yet dealt with were now dealing with Darius, and the sound of that was the specific ugly sound of men fighting in a confined space, graceless and immediate and costly. She got up. The working was centered on Celine. That was the operative fact. Celine was the point of it, the architect and the fuel, and while Celine was standing and focused and had both hands in the position that maintained the working, it would keep building. The pressure in Lysera's chest told her how much time that left. Not much. She crossed the room. Celine raised one hand and the working intensified, and Lysera felt it in her bones and in the specific tender awareness of the 3 lives she was carrying, and she kept moving because stopping was not an option she was going to take. Stop, Celine said. She did not stop. I will finish it, Celine said. I will end the bloodline here, tonight, and there will be nothing left to document or inherit, or... Lysera hit her, not with the knife, with the flat of her palm, open, directly across the specific point on the jaw that her father had taught her when she was 12 years old in a different life. It was not elegant, it was not surgical. It was the oldest mechanism in the world, one body stopping another body through direct application of force. And it worked the way it had always worked, which was completely. Celine's head snapped back. Her hands broke position. The working collapsed. The amber light went out. The The room went dark except for the torch Darius had dropped somewhere in the fight behind her, burning on the stone floor and throwing ordinary yellow light across ordinary stone. The working's absence was physical, a sudden release of pressure, a return of normal temperature, the sound of actual air moving in an actual room. Lysara stood over Celine, who was down on one knee, hand to her jaw, looking up. The knife was in Lysara's hand. It had been in her hand since she crossed the room. She looked at Celine, at the woman who had built 10 years of patient architecture around destroying her, who had poisoned her with the precision of a craftsperson, who had stood at a column in the throne hall and watched the completion of her design without a visible flicker of satisfaction, because satisfaction was not the point for someone like Celine, outcome was the point, always only outcome. She looked at Celine and she thought about what it would cost to use the knife, and what it would cost not to. She thought, this is what everything has been building to. The moment that defines what you actually are rather than what you've been surviving as. She thought about the women who had done what Celine had done throughout the Empire's history, who had operated from the absolute conviction that their judgment was correct and their methods were justified, and the people in their way were acceptable losses. She thought about how that conviction propagated through institutions and generations, passing from one capable and ruthless person to the next, each one certain that their particular version of necessary evil was different from the others. She thought, if I use this knife, I become a data point in that same history. She lowered the knife. Get up, she said. Celine looked at her. Get up, Lysara said again. You're going to stand in front of the High Lords and the Lord Commander and the full court, and you are going to answer for what you did. In public, on record, not as a body, as a person who made choices and has to account for them. She held Celine's eyes. That's worse than the knife, and you know it. Celine looked at her for a long moment. The expression on her face was not fear and not respect, but something in between those things. The expression of someone who has just encountered a logic they had not included in their model of the situation. She got up. Darius was behind Lysara. She heard his breathing, ragged, uneven, the breathing of someone who had been fighting in close quarters and was managing pain somewhere in the body. She turned. He was on his feet. He had a cut above his right ear that was bleeding freely, and his formal coat was torn at the shoulder, and he was looking at her with the expression she had seen in the North Corridor room, stripped of every layer of the king, down to the actual person. Are you all right? He said. She thought about the question. She thought about the full scope of what it encompassed. The working, the months, the road, the 3 lives. She made an honest assessment. Yes, she said. He nodded once. He looked at Celine. Tolvar, he said, to the room, to the door, to the structure of command that existed on the other side of the door. His voice was back to its carrying quality, the room-bending frequency, but it was rough at the edges in a way the throne hall voice had never been. Human, rather than institutional. Tolvar came through the door with 3 guards. He looked at the room. He looked at Celine. He looked at the torch on the floor and the stone dust and the particular quality of air that lingered after a bloodworking has been interrupted. He was a man who had been at the Empire's edge for 30 years, and he understood what he was looking at without requiring it to be explained. He took Celine by the arm. She went without resistance. At the door, she stopped and looked back at Lysara. Just once. The look of a woman cataloging a final piece of information. You'll rebuild it wrong, Celine said. Whatever you build from here, you'll make it softer and call it stronger, and in 20 years someone else will be standing where I stood. Maybe, Lysara said. That's for 20 years from now to determine. Tonight, you're done. Celine left. The room held the absence of her like a space recently vacated. Lysara stood in the center of the old council chamber and felt the working's residue dissipate, slowly, the way the particular cold of a malevolent thing dissipates, not all at once but in layers, the outermost releasing first and then the deeper ones, until the room was simply a room again, and the air was simply air, and the stone was 40 years old and cold and entirely indifferent to everything that had just happened in it. Ren was at the door. She had not left. Of course she had not left. Lysara looked at the girl for a long moment. Ren looked back. Neither of them said anything immediately, because neither of them needed to.
They had been through enough of this particular silence. The silence of two people who have been through something real together and are standing in its aftermath without needing to perform anything about it. "I should have told you about Aldrich," Ren said finally. "Yes," Lysera said. "I was going to. I was trying to find the right time." "I know." Lysera looked at her steadily. "There isn't always a right time. Sometimes you just have to say the thing when it needs to be said and accept the consequences." Ren absorbed this. She nodded once, with the careful attentiveness of someone filing a principle they intend to keep. "Are we—" she started. "Yes," Lysera said. "We are." Ren's face did the thing it had done outside the throne hall on Blood Moon night. The hand-over-mouth thing, the thing that meant she was managing something significant and doing it by containment rather than expression. Then she straightened and dropped her hand and stood with the specific quality she had always stood with, the steady-eyed quality that had been Lysera's first accurate read of her. This girl does not quit. Darius had moved to the window. The eastern sky was beginning its first gray, the dark thinning at the edges in the way that dark thins just before dawn. Not gradually, but in stages, each one a definite step toward something different. She went to stand beside him. They stood at the window of the old council chamber and looked at the city below, the capital of the Iron Fang Empire, which was waking up slowly and did not yet know what had happened in the building at its center tonight. They stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him again, as she had in the study, and the blood from the cut at his temple had dried in a dark line along his jaw, and he had not wiped it off. "The court needs to know everything," she said. "All of it. Not a managed version, not the political narrative. Everything. The poison, the records, the banishment, the working tonight, all of it in front of the High Lords and the full assembly." "I know," he said. "And it needs to come from you," she said. "Not from Tolvar's report, not from the documentation. From you, directly, accepting what happened and what your role in it was." He was quiet for a moment. "That will cost the throne." "The throne will survive it," she said. "It survived 10 years of Selena Vorath. It can survive a king telling the truth about himself." She paused. "What it cannot survive is another generation built on the same foundation of managed information and convenient silence. The corruption did not start with Selene. She worked with what was already there." He turned to look at her. She looked back. "You're not wrong," he said. "I know I'm not." The ghost of something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the echo of one, the shape of a thing that might become one again eventually, given time and something to work with. "You never were," he said. "I knew that. I knew it, and I let other things be louder." She thought about what to say to that. She thought about all the versions of this conversation she had rehearsed in the northern dark, lying against the stable wall in the Vethkai settlement, or walking through frozen terrain, or sitting in safe houses while the Empire tried to locate her. She had prepared versions that were precise and devastating, versions that laid out exactly what he had cost both of them with the same methodical documentation she had brought to the evidence case. She had prepared them, and she was not going to use them. Not because they weren't true, because she had come to understand somewhere in the months of raw north and deliberate survival that the sharp and devastating version of the truth was not actually the complete version. The complete version included the fact that she was still here, that she had built something in herself during the months of exile that she would not have built without the exile, that the person standing at this window was not the person who had walked into the antechamber on Blood Moon night, and that the difference was not only loss. She had been remade. She had remade herself with the specific tools available: cold, clarity, necessity, and the result was not who she would have chosen to become. It was harder than that. It was more permanent than that. It was, she thought, more real than that. "I need you to understand something," she said. He waited. "I am not the same person you banished. I am not going to be the person you knew before, the one who managed herself in this court and measured her words and waited for the right moment to be heard. That person is gone. What I am now took everything I had to build, and I am not going to unmake it to fit a role that was designed before I knew what I was capable of." "I know," he said. "I don't know yet what this looks like," she said. "Between us." I don't know what it can be, or whether it can be anything beyond the immediate practical fact that we have 3 children who need a world that is worth being born into. I need you to understand that I am not giving you an answer tonight. Tonight I am telling you what the conditions are." He held her eyes. He did not argue. He did not offer assurances or press for something she had not offered. He simply looked at her with the full attentiveness of a man who has learned, at significant personal cost, that this woman's conditions are not negotiable, and that the appropriate response to them is not negotiation, but acceptance. "I understand," he said. She nodded. They stood at the window as the dawn came up. The real dawn this time, the ordinary one, gray gold and cold, and arriving with the complete indifference of days to the weight of what they carry. The city below was moving now, smoke from morning fires, the early commerce of the market quarter, the capital doing what capitals do, continuing, regardless. She thought about the high lord she was going to face in the assembly. She thought about the documentation and the account she was going to give, and the specific quality of attention she was going to require from every person in that room. She thought about the court's structure, the places in it that had been built on fear, and the places that had been built on loyalty, and the difference between those two foundations when you put weight on them. She thought about what came after the assembly, the rebuilding, the slower, harder, less dramatic work of taking a thing that had been built wrong and identifying which parts of it were load-bearing and which parts could be removed and what needed to be put in their place. She was not naive about it. She had spent 5 years inside this institution, understanding its weight and its fracture points, and she knew that what she was proposing, what she intended, was not a matter of weeks or even years. It was a matter of a lifetime, her children's lifetimes. She pressed her hand flat against her abdomen one last time, in the morning light, in the ordinary air of a room that had been extraordinary and was becoming ordinary again. She thought, "You are going to be born into something better than what made you necessary." That was not a promise she could guarantee. She knew that. Every parent who had ever made that promise to a child not yet born had known it was not entirely within their power to deliver. But she had also learned, in the frozen north, in the borrowed coat, in the specific brutality of months spent building from nothing, that the gap between what you can guarantee and what you can work toward is not an argument against working toward it. It is the only argument for it. Wren came to stand at the window on her other side. The 3 of them stood in the gray-gold morning and looked at the city and said nothing for a moment that was not silence, because silence is empty, and this was not empty. This was the specific fullness of an aftermath, the particular quality of air that exists when the storm has completed itself and what remains is still standing. "What do we do first?" Wren said. Lysera thought about the assembly. She thought about Tolvar and Celine, and the documentation and the 30 years of institutional rot that needed to be named before it could be addressed. She thought about the court and the high lords, and the long, unglamorous work of rebuilding the thing that had been built wrong. She thought about the girl beside her who had packed a second bag without being asked, and the man on her other side who had sent a courier into the frozen north with a letter that said, "Come back if you can," and the 3 lives inside her that were going to need a world worth inhabiting. She thought about who she was now, not the Omega the Empire had expelled, not the Luna it had made and unmade, not any version of herself that had been defined by someone else's narrative of her. Something that had been forged in the particular conditions of a year that had required everything she had, and that had come out the other side still intact, still oriented, still able to name what she valued and choose it without apology. She was the woman who had walked out the north gate with a packed bag and a secret and a hunting knife and a decision. She was the woman who had come back. "We call the assembly," she said, "and we tell them the truth, the whole truth, every piece of it." She paused. "And then we start." The twin moons were setting on the western horizon, faint now in the growing daylight, more suggestion than presence, 2 pale shapes descending together at the edge of the sky. She looked at them for a moment, not with sentiment, with the attentiveness of someone who has learned to pay attention to the ordinary world because the ordinary world is the actual world, and the actual world is the only one there is to work with. Then she turned from the window. She had work to do.